Howdy, my name is Nonat, and it's finally here. No, not the Pathfinder 2e remaster, that's coming out November 15th, but we have some breadcrumbs about the new changes to one of the classes that is supposedly getting the biggest revamp in the Pathfinder 2e remaster project, and that is our dear friend, the Witch. Hopefully not just a wizard clone with a little bit more emphasis on their pet cat. Hopefully the Witch is getting a little bit more personality. We've waited a long time for this, and we've also waited a long time for something else. Something that you have been very patient with, and that we, here at Sinclair's, cannot thank you enough for. But all backers of Sinclair's library have just gotten their PDF copies of the first edition of Sinclair's Almanac. 2 new classes, bunch of new subclasses, magic items, 5 full chapters of stuff flashing on screen here that you can get right now if you backed the project back all the way, not this last June, but the June before. We hit some heavy hiccups, things were tough, but things have worked out and it is in your hands. The classes, the archetypes, the magic items, it's all there for you to play with, ready to use. And the codex is on its way. Just want to say, this isn't a sponsorship, this isn't me plugging the product, I guess, but I just want to let you know that if you back the project, the PDF is available. You can go read it right now, it's all there, it's all real, and yes, I will be covering it on the channel later this week. So, stick around for that. Thank you again from the bottom of our hearts for all of your patience. We couldn't have made this product without you. So, looking at your comments from the last video where I talked about the Ranger changes, most of you actually liked it when I read off the page and also added my little interjections like I did, because a lot of you actually treat my content like a podcast, which is kind of flattering. You know, a lot of you will drive to work and put me on in the background, so thank you for that. I'm glad I can make you less lonely on your drive to work. Also, stop at that stoplight. Don't run red lights, please. So let's dive in to what we've gotten about the Witch. As we've mentioned in some of our past material, the Witch was a class we were excited to put into the first book of the remaster, the Player Core, which if you remember, Witch came out in the APG, which was sort of the second main book of Pathfinder 2e, but they're putting it in the first book of the remaster because they want to get it into people's hands, which I respect. The Witch is a really iconic fantasy theme with a ton of historical and cultural grounding, and a popular player archetype for many characters. I like that they acknowledge this, that a witch is very different from a wizard. You know, a Baba Yaga is very different from a Gandalf. I would never call them the same class. Unfortunately, we were also aware that the Witch class has not quite always done the best at living up to this fantasy. The remaster sees the Witch as one of the most heavily changed classes in ways that aim both to increase the class's overall power budget, as well as to express the Witch's unique flavor in an evocative way. These are both things we really want to hear, especially the unique flavor. You know, they want it to feel different from a wizard. They shouldn't be casting spells the same way, they shouldn't have access to all of the same stuff, so that's great to hear. I'm curious what increasing the power budget means. Is that going to mean more spell slots? Are they going to improve their focus hexes? What's that going to mean? Maybe better, more unique feats? That'd be awesome. I'm really curious to see what's going to happen with this. In Pathfinder, the Witch's defining feature is their relationship with their familiar and their patron. The Witch does not get power from study or from inherent gifts, but as part of a bargain made with a mysterious patron entity. Think very similar to D&D 5e's Warlock, with a magical familiar there to provide power and make sure the Witch is advancing the patron's agenda. This is something I hope they really push, because it did not read that much in the original iteration of the Witch. The familiar is there to ensure that the Witch is doing the patron's bidding. Whereas, I guess a D&D Warlock, you would say that they sign a contract and say, okay, this is going to happen in exchange for power. Whereas, I believe with a Witch patron, there's not a contract per se. It's more of a verbal agreement of, I give you power, you do my thing. I give you cute cat, which casts fireballs, you get this magical artifact for me. Either party could technically rescind their part of the bargain at any time, but they know that if they do, they lose their benefit. If the Witch stops helping the patron restricts the magic. If the patron restricts the magic, the Witch stops doing what the patron needs them to do. It's a really cool symbiotic relationship rather than a lawful contract. To highlight the fact that the Witch is the premier familiar user in the game, we've increased the capabilities of their familiar from its original version. Now the Witch's familiar gains even more abilities, one of which is unique to the patron. That is so huge, because you want to know the difference in current Pathfinder 2e between a Witch familiar and a Wizard familiar? 2 extra abilities. That's it. A Wizard familiar starts with 2 abilities, a Witch familiar starts with 4. That's it! Aside from flavor saying that the familiar is their spellbook and communicates with their patron, that's it! So giving them unique familiar and master abilities that are only available to the Witch and only available to that subclass of patron, that is hype! These unique familiar abilities both help to express the patron's theme, and they generate a passive effect every time the Witch casts or sustains one of their hex cantrips. For example, a familiar granted by the Silence in Snow patron is forever cold to the touch. It might be the color of ice, or its breath might crystallize in the air, and so every time you cast or sustain one of your hex spells, frost will form next to your familiar, creating difficult terrain. This is interesting. I like that there's going to be passive effects every time you cast a spell, and things like difficult terrain, that's going to affect your allies too. It's going to make the familiar more important on the battlefield because these effects will keep happening, and I want this to mean the familiar will be more encouraged to get into the fray, not only to get these passive effects, but give us a reason to cast touch spells through our familiar. Use that familiar ability, because I've never seen it used once in Pathfinder 2e, the one where you can deliver a touch spell through your familiar. That never happens. My big fear here is, will the familiars be sturdy enough? Will their armor class be good enough? Because as it stands, familiars are incredibly weak and can easily go down in an unlucky critical hit or a couple of easy hits. Many of these abilities are strong but have very short ranges from your familiar, so be sure to keep your little Shadow Cat or Cursed Raven safe with spells like Phase Familiar or Patron's Puppet, which can help to shield them from damage or let them dart quickly in and out of safety. I love this, especially if those focus spells are given up front or they're easy feat options. Excuse me, I'm dying. And especially if they're like reactions, I think giving the Witch more emphasis on protecting their pet while sustaining these hexes and getting the benefit of the passive benefit of their familiar, that's going to be a great gameplay loop. You know, every turn is going to maybe be repositioned a little, maybe not even reposition. A good turn might look like sustain your hex on the enemy, cast a protective spell on your familiar, use your action to give your familiar an action so they can use one of their abilities, like delivering a touch spell. That might be a 2-action thing, but you see what I'm saying? I think there's going to be a lot more interaction with the familiar, which is how the class should work. And I mean that on a mechanical level. It's obvious that it's easy to have interaction with your familiar on a flavor roleplay level. That's going to be up to the table. But the familiar in itself does not do enough in combat, in roleplay scenarios right now, to warrant them giving the Witch unique identity compared to the Wizard. We've taken advantage of the remaster to also do some general quality of life changes to the Witch and make their abilities a little easier to use. Many hex cantrips now no longer make enemies temporarily immune to their effects once cast, as we felt that having to sustain them and having the limit of 1 hex cantrip per turn was already enough of a limit for most abilities. That's absolutely fair. These hex cantrips, I would wager on average they are weaker than a martial melee attack roll, but they come with bonus effects if they fail, really good effects if they critical fail, and it's unfortunate to see them succeed their saving throw, and your option is to sustain it for 1 point of damage per turn, or desustain it and lose it for the rest of the combat. I also really like this line. It turns out your patron doesn't like being pestered for supernatural favors 3 times in a 6-second window. So like it said, 1 hex cantrip per turn, but all hex cantrips are 1-action spells, which is awesome. Another way the Witch can really separate themselves. 1-action spells, very, very rare in this game, usually very, very weak, so being the core part of their kit, I think that's awesome. We also expanded some hex cantrips that were overly narrow, like Wilding Word, which used to function only against animals, fungi, or plants, but now function against any creature, with animals, fungi, and plants being especially vulnerable. That's a really good way to do it. Sometimes those spells, they feel really good when they come up, and then when you go 9 sessions without your main hex cantrip even being applicable, not to any fault of the DM even, or even yourself, it just sucks, it just feels bad. But I think giving it a base effect and then an improved effect against specific targets, that's a way to do it. That's my issue with the current champion causes. I would love to see some kind of difference with those, where those give you really good benefits against a very specific type of enemy, and then nothing else. Between loosening these restrictions and the unique abilities from familiars that happen when you cast or sustain a hex cantrip, the witch should be seeing a fair bit of hexing during their turns. But of course, as your witch grows in power, so too can your familiar, which can gain various special abilities through higher level feats. Some of these feats let your patron themselves manifest through your familiar to spooky effect. For instance, the new Patron's Presence feat directs your patron's baleful attention to the battlefield, partially disrupting the magic of other spellcasters. This is super cool. It is a once per hour, 2-action ability that your familiar can do, and a 15-foot emanation from your familiar causes a will save only against enemies. This does not affect allies, which is already amazing. A failed save is stupefied 2, crit failed is stupefied 3, and this happens every time they enter the aura or start their turn in the aura. If you can get your familiar to the back line onto the enemy spellcaster, giving stupefied 2 is insane. That's an instant, DC 7 flat check to fail any given spell? That's incredible. The downside, of course, as it tends to be with a lot of these remaster sneak peeks, it's a high level feat. This is level 14, but it is once per hour. It's very good. It doesn't use a focus point. It's just something your familiar can do, or I guess you can do, that's focused on your familiar. It can be sustained up to a minute. It's an interesting effect that it's an ability that can be sustained. It's not a spell, but it still needs to be sustained. Then again, they did just remaster the term sustain. It's no longer sustain a spell, it's just sustain. So maybe other classes will see sustainable abilities that are not inherently spells. I think that's a cool way to open up design. But yeah, same issue I sort of have with the Warden's Reload. Really cool, makes for an awesome little addition to your kit. Just unfortunate that it comes online at level 14, which I won't throw out a random arbitrary percentage, but I'll wager a small percentage of players get that far. It's great for things like Fist of the Ruby Phoenix, which starts at level 11. It's great for those campaigns, but correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but most campaigns tend to start at level 1, especially if they're homebrewed. Everyone has that ideal idea of a 1 to 20 campaign start to finish, and who can blame you for that? You love that rags to riches, 0 to hero kind of gameplay that you can get from a 1 to 20 campaign. And then most of those campaigns fizzle out by level 11 because we're all adults and we're busy and we have lives. Or we're kids and we're busy and we have lives. Beyond some of these feats that lean on the Pathfinder side of witch mythology, we also wanted to go back to the rich folklore of witches worldwide and draw on this when we were giving witches new feats. And they're getting quite a fair number of them. That's what I said earlier. That's what I said like 5 minutes ago. I really want witches to get more unique feats that are not the same feats as wizard. Thank you for listening to me, even though I made this video after you wrote this. It would be remiss of me not to call out my very witchy colleagues Simone de Soleil and Shay Snow, who drew on their deep knowledge of folk magic to suggest the seeds that grew into abilities like Ceremonial Knife, which allows a knife or dagger to direct magical energies like a wand. Yo, you can like imbue spells into your like normal dagger you'd use and use that as your once per day wand. I freaking love that. The new Iron Teeth Witches armament, supplementing Eldritch Nails and Living Hair. Okay, alright. They might be combining Eldritch Nails and Hair into one feat, because those feats were not great originally. They weren't doing much for you. Or Witch's Broom, which lets you anoint a broom with flying ointments to transform it into a flying broomstick that you can ride through the night sky, which also works on a staff, polearm, or other broom-like object. Not saying there are vacuum cleaners in Galarian, but I am saying the book gives you what you need to live your best Mary Sanderson life. And with that, it's time for me to get into my witch's hut and use its new leap option to spin thrice and cast a 10th rank teleport away. James, you're a nerd. So there we go. We didn't get a ton of information, but at the same time we did. I feel like I have more questions than I did when I started reading this, but in a really good way. I'm way more excited for this now that we have the basic idea of what the witch might look like. We're not going to know until it actually comes out. This is probably the least we've seen from a remaster post yet, but I think they did that on purpose. They gave us enough breadcrumbs to lead us to that witch's hut so they can put us in the oven and bake us into cookies like Hansel and Gretel. Please don't eat me, Paizo.